Every season, it's the same.
Well, there's the full-time whistle. It's another win for Manchester United, who climb into the top four for the time being at least.
And Vardy's put it in. They are level.
That is a big 3 points for Frank Lampard and Chelsea.
4 teams, 4 spots.
All right, so based on this, our prediction is Manchester United to finish third on 70, Chelsea on 67, and Leicester City on 63. So if you're a Foxes fan...
But this season, there's a twist.
We have huge breaking news here at Sky Sports News, because following a hearing of UEFA, Manchester City are to be punished for breaking financial rules in football, and they have been banned from all UEFA competition for the 2 seasons after this one.
With Manchester City the potential recipients of a Champions League ban, we could see a surprise addition to the competition's English quota. But Manchester City's ban also raises questions about the importance of the Champions League within the English game.
De Bruyne, he's 29, he's in his prime, like he wants to go and win more than what he's won at City, and then it might be a case of saying, okay, I want to go and win this Champions League somewhere else.
The race for the Champions League will see some clubs' fortunes made, and some clubs' fortunes dented. In this episode we ask, what does this year's race for the Champions League look like, and who is set to lose the most by missing out?
I'm interested purely to see who wins a race away from the bottom, because it's kind of been defined by the technical poverty of some of these sides.
Seb Stafford-Bloor is Tifo's content and scripts editor, whose work can also be found at FourFourTwo and Football365.
It's interesting and it's close, so that is something.
Let's talk about the final straight in the race for the Champions League spots then. How would you say this season's race compares to previous seasons?
It's had some novelty. It's rare that so many quote-unquote Big Six teams are as flawed as these ones are. And it's also interesting to see some new participants. It's interesting to talk about the dynamics of, for instance, Sheffield United's squad and their narrow group of players surviving a 38-game season versus, you know, the merits of Chelsea versus Tottenham versus Arsenal versus Manchester United, which is a debate that, even though some of the detail changes over time, becomes quite tired. So I think it's had some different dynamics, and it's not as relentless. I mean, in previous years, the race for the top 4 has involved teams that drop very few points, and whereby the jostling for position is determined by who draws away from home and who only scores 4 goals instead of 5. There's a little bit of a generalisation, but it has been very much like that. Whereas this season, everyone's losing all the time. So it's an interesting twist. It's almost, as I said right at the beginning, it's going to reward who can be least bad least often, if that makes sense.
Manchester City have been banned from the Champions League for the next 2 seasons for breaking financial fair play rules. Europe's football governing body, UEFA.
Obviously, this season's race is complexified by Manchester City's case with the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Could you talk us through the permutations of that situation with regards to Champions League spots?
First of all, we're expecting a verdict next Monday, the 13th of July, probably late afternoon. The outcome is pretty simple. If Manchester City's ban is upheld, then the team that finishes 5th in the Premier League, on the basis that Manchester City are already occupying one of the Champions League qualification spots, the 5th place team will qualify for next year's tournament. There are instances in which, you know, there might be a compromise with the ban, it might be suspended, and in which case we revert to the normal top 4 finishes leading to Champions League group stage qualification.
How do you think the race for Champions League spots will look, depending on which one of those scenarios unfolds, with the 4 or 5 places technically available?
Well, naturally 5 places makes it a little bit more interesting. As a fun little dynamic, a couple of hours after that verdict comes down, Manchester United will play Southampton at home. And as we're recording this, Manchester United are actually in 5th place and set to be the main beneficiary of a City ban. Nice little bit of irony there. I think it makes the season a little bit more compelling, because theoretically I don't think Arsenal and Sheffield United are in this race anymore. But I think if City's ban is upheld, then you could probably make a case for Wolves still being involved. So I think it remains a sort of a top 6 battle, whereas top 4, Chelsea at the moment, as things stand, are 8 points ahead of Arsenal. So I'd say, set to hold off anyone below 7th. And even Wolves, 5 points at this point of the season with only 15 left to play for is a huge difference. So I think it broadens the opportunity naturally, and also gives a little bit of comfort to sides like Leicester. Leicester won at the weekend. They sorely needed that, but I would hesitate in saying that their slump is over. So that would be a little bit of a comfort for them if 5th place was also providing passage in the Champions League.
You've mentioned the importance of form. How important do you think the form is going to be, given that it's just such a small tranche of games available now? Because you've said we've seen Chelsea and Leicester wobbling a little bit in recent weeks. Manchester United are coming on strong, and of those 3 teams, you would put the momentum with Manchester United. Would you say that makes Manchester United favourites in the race if you considered those 3 sides in particular?
Yeah, I probably agree with that. I think form and confidence are really important because since we've come out of the lockdown, I think what we've seen is defensively a lot of mistakes and a real lack of integrity to some of the defensive structures. You're seeing some really, really poor performances without the ball, and quite logically, that favours the team that have the confidence with it. Now, I think Manchester United have vastly improved, but I think some of their performance has been accentuated by the poverty of some of the teams they've come up against. Obviously, Bournemouth are very much front and centre of that list, and that showed over the weekend, but I think it was sort of equally true at Brighton. You're seeing teams that sort of are willing to express themselves, who possess a sort of a modicum of cohesion in the attacking third of the pitch, really doing some damage. And so you would think that would last until the end of the season. I don't think that we're going to revert to a sort of mid-season normality anytime soon. So I think it's almost like an ad hoc version of the game, isn't it? It's not one that favours. Do you remember those sort of old tactical battles between Chelsea and Liverpool all those years ago when they were very stale games and settled by 1 or 2 goals? It's just not that kind of time at the moment. It's such a strange environment. And yeah, that does seem to be playing into Manchester United's hands.
Nicely tucked to Tierney by Aubameyang, trying to get it back in early. Oh, and it's a wonderful goal from the teenager. Bukayo Saka shows what he's all about again. He had to adjust his body.
You've mentioned that the 5th place addition in this race could favour Wolves. There was a game yesterday between Arsenal and Wolves that Wolves lost. How important do you think that result is going to be in the final rundown?
Well, Wolves would have moved level on points with Man United. Big setback from a confidence standpoint. That's quite a tough defeat to take because Arsenal are an improving side, but they're still not a particularly good one. And the means by which Wolves lost the game will be dispiriting. But we just talked about the importance of confidence and attacking belief. And the dynamic of that game was, not always, but generally, Wolves trying to be the protagonist and asking a set of fairly banal questions for the Arsenal defence, which were easy to answer. Now, with only 5 games to go, what does that do to players like Raul Jimenez, Diogo Jota, Adama Traoré, players who sort of, they rise and fall on the thermals of their own self-belief? So in this sort of weird little microcosm of a season, I think that's very damaging. And losing at home to a side like Arsenal, that's the first time Arsenal have beaten a team away from home who started the game ahead of them in the table for something like 18 months or something. Forgive me if the timeline is wrong, but regardless, it's significant. Arsenal don't win or haven't been winning that kind of game. And so from a Wolves perspective, you don't want to be the team that, you don't want to be Dr. Wolves, do you, really?
We need to talk about the impact of the restart on this race for the Champions League. Given the fact that a lot of the games are being played in a short space of time with no pre-season, does this put the teams with the deeper squads in a pole position in the race?
Yep, it's a ludicrous advantage to have. Added to which, let me just add in the 5 substitutes. It's an absurd advantage. If you look at the sum of the games, I think I would. It's not a Premier League game, but if you look at the Manchester United against Norwich City game last weekend, obviously of the 5 substitutes, I think Ole Solskjaer used Brennan Williams, but then was able to introduce Marcus Rashford, Paul Pogba and Anthony Martial and Nemanja Matic. So not only does sort of having the deeper squad full of better players enable you to go between games and to survive the rigours of playing every 3 days, but also within games, your ability to add these little injections of power at critical moments is greatly enhanced. So there's really no excuse for teams of that standing with these kind of wage bills not capitalising at the moment.
So with all this in mind, what's your gut feeling about who will be in those Champions League spots by the end of the season?
I think I would take, at this point, obviously Liverpool, Manchester City, Leicester and Manchester United. And if cast rule unfavourably to Manchester City, I'd add Chelsea in 5th spot.
So that's how things are sitting in the Premier League right now. But just how important is Champions League qualification to these clubs individually? Just how valuable is Champions League qualification for these clubs?
Hugely. I mean, by memory, the 15 million euros just for qualifying for the group stage. But, I mean, the financials are one part of this. The real importance is the legitimacy. I think where it matters is in terms of what a club is able to sell in terms of its proposition to players, but also to sponsors and to commercial entities. One of the consequences of the pandemic is that these big, long commercial contracts, sort of that were signed over 10, 15 years, they're either going to greatly shorten or they're going to be loaded with mitigating penalty clauses that protect the sponsor. Or alternatively, they're going to be signed with big bonus clauses which reward participation. And that's particularly true. If you look at a club like Manchester United, for instance, the caveat there has been the size of the brand versus the level of performance. And I think the trend in the game should be, at least if it was sensible, to reward those clubs that are participating at a high level. And that means the Champions League. So with the qualification comes these vast payments. There's a statistic which is quite illustrative of this. So the season that Chelsea won the Europa League, 2018-2019, they actually earned less than the season with which they were eliminated in the first knockout round of the Champions League. So that kind of gives an idea of the disparity between the two. But also, if you factor in things like, you know, a reward from a shirt sponsor for reaching a semi-final or what have you, the value is immeasurable. All things factored in, you're either in it or you're not, in a sense. So it is quite literally that binary in terms of your audiences with sponsors, your ability to sell your club to future players. If you're pitching yourselves to a 22, 23-year-old footballer, they just don't want to play in the Europa League. They want European football and they want the Champions League as a prerequisite. So I don't think you can compete without it.
You've talked about the sort of impacts that Champions League can have on particularly elite clubs. I'm interested in your thoughts on what impact it would make on a smaller club like Wolves, because let's assume that someone like Wolves got into the group stages, got the £50 million, didn't get any further than that. What sort of benefit do you think they're getting from that small influx of income, relatively speaking, compared to like a Premier League TV rights package, and the sense of authority that it gives you as well? Are a club like Wolves benefiting less than, say, Manchester United, who could go a lot further, get a lot more money, get a lot better sponsorship deals, etc. from that?
In one sense, the lens isn't quite as strong because the benefit of Champions League qualification is ultimately kind of multiplied by the strength of the brand of the club. So that's your Manchester United example. I think for a club like Wolves, it's important financially, yes, that we've covered that. Going back to that idea of the proposition being sold to players, Wolverhampton does not have geographically the advantages of Manchester or Liverpool or London. And if you're able, in Wolves' situation, to say that this is a place in which you could play Champions League football, this is your avenue, this is your, if you want to be cynical about it, this is your shop window, then that can, in a sort of abstract way, offset some of the disadvantages that being based in the Midlands exposes a team to. For those who aren't kind of familiar with the geography of the United Kingdom, the Midlands is a bit of a neglected part of the country, as a lot of towns and cities are outside of London, outside of the major cities. And so Wolves' success, nice a place as Wolverhampton is to visit, is a little bit unlikely. And Champions League is a way of removing one of the theoretical obstacles to growth. It's because you say, well, we can provide that here. It's sort of the modern equivalent of, back in the day, players moving to specific clubs because they wanted to play for England. The Champions League has kind of taken the place of that desire, in a way. And it's about ambition. It's kind of, I think, for clubs, not just of Wolves' size, but for clubs like Leicester, Everton, probably even still, I guess, Tottenham, what you're saying is we are not somewhere where you cannot fulfill your ambition, and that's a really valuable commodity in the modern game.
Be interesting to talk about Leicester here as well, because they're in a similar situation to Wolves, maybe a few years further down the timeline. They've played Champions League football before, they've got quite deep in Champions League football, and it feels like they're a club who are looking to cement themselves amongst the elite clubs in England. We've already mentioned that they've had something of a setback in their form recently. How problematic would it be for them if they fell out of the top 4 or 5 in the next 5 games?
The obvious point to make is that Leicester are built around a nucleus of young, developing footballers who, most likely, if we're being pragmatic about this, they are not going to spend the rest of their careers at Leicester. And so the trick in this situation is to delay the departure of a Wilfred Ndidi, a Yuri Tielemans, Harvey Barnes, James Maddison, these types of players, Ben Chilwell. You want to give them as much of a reason to stay for as long as possible. Mitigating that is the fact that Leicester are not a club that roll over for anybody. We learned this from the Harry Maguire episode. You can buy their players and you can take them away from them, but you're going to have to pay for them. When they set a price tag, they are well run enough and financially sound enough to dig their feet in. So I don't think all of a sudden we're going to have a mutiny, but it's about focus. If you have a group of footballers who are all of the same age profile, who all have roughly the same ambitions, if you have a situation potentially where someone becomes a little bit disaffected, someone starts thinking, yeah, I don't know, is this the right place for me? That's quite infectious, and that's quite difficult to deal with, no matter how positive your manager is or, you know, how good their rhetoric is. And so I think the fear for Leicester isn't that, you know, they don't qualify for the Champions League and everyone leaves. It's that they don't qualify for the Champions League and the water supply is infected as a result of that. And then there's a set of tenuous negatives going forward. Psychologically also, it's very hard to measure what this would be, but you know, in any sport, if you hold an advantage and you throw it away, the Van der Velde situation, I know they're not competing for a trophy, but that's damaging. That's going to take some getting over. If having been an assumed participant in the Champions League for so long now, they fall out and finish 6th or 5th with Manchester City included, that's going to need the football equivalent of a little bit of counselling, I'd have thought.
If Leicester and Wolves fail to qualify for the Champions League this year, do you think they will have a harder time qualifying next year, for example?
Yes, because do you remember Snakes and Ladders when you were a boy? It's like that board game, but you don't have any ladders. It's just snakes. So for a club like Leicester, for a club like Wolves, in the past for clubs like Everton, for Tottenham, if you reach a certain height of the league and you fail to get over the line in the sand, if you fail to put your shoulder through the door into the little exclusive club marked Champions League, you become incredibly vulnerable. You become perceived as a threat. So a couple of things. So Leicester are a good example because if they don't finish in the Champions League places this season, then they will lose at least one of these players. Maybe for a lot of money, but they will. They'll lose a Ben Chilwell to Chelsea. And that's another part of the problem. You're losing the potential revenue, but you're also losing an asset to a direct rival. And that's the kind of the snake element of the league. And if we look back at the history of any club that has threatened that little private party, you see the same pattern, whether it's Tottenham losing Michael Carrick and Gareth Bale and Luka Modric, or whatever the case may be. That hasn't changed. So the depth of and the size of the broadcasting contract has protected these clubs to a certain extent. It's enabled them to drive a harder bargain and maintain a stronger negotiating position. At the end of the day, a player that plays for Leicester is still going to want to play for Man United, no matter what the levels of superiority are. I mean, the idea that Harry Maguire should have left the Leicester that he did for the Manchester United that he joined, irrespective of what's happened in the months since, is nonsense. Because one catered to his abilities and to his ambition in the way that at the time another didn't. But yet, it still has that appeal. So it's grossly unfair because these bigger clubs, legacy clubs as you term them, they have a permanence that the others don't. So Manchester United can afford to be less than themselves for 7 years. But if Leicester have a bad season, or if Tottenham have a bad season, or Wolves had a bad season, the project doesn't die, but it almost resets to a ground zero. Well, maybe not quite as ground zero, but it loses its momentum. The air rushes out of the balloon, whatever metaphor you want to employ. And so it's perilous. So is it a literal danger? I don't know, but it definitely affects the way these teams are seen. Because outside of the top four, I mean top four in the sense of the Sky Four, teams are almost fluttering their eyelashes. They're trying to show that they have upper mobility, that they have momentum. And failure, even in inverted commas, is incredibly costly in that scenario.
I'm interested in looking at the legacy clubs as well. So firstly, Chelsea, who are in an interesting situation given that they're trying to force the financial situation of the coronavirus pandemic into their own ends and get some kind of benefit from that. They're able to bring in players like Timo Werner above Liverpool, who've just won the league, which seems an interesting dynamic. How important will it be for Chelsea if they don't manage to get the Champions League? If someone like Timo Werner comes in and is then faced with the prospect of the Europa League when his own club have got the possibility of playing in the Champions League?
Had the pandemic not happened, it's a different question because obviously there'd have been a financial fair play implication. So the starting point here is to know that financial period 2018 to 2019, Roman Abramovich put in £247 million of his own money into Chelsea, which is good in one way because it suggests that he's still very committed to the cause. At the moment, we're led to believe that UEFA will relax the FFP implications. So there's no financial problem of a loss of revenue, really. Nothing that Abramovich couldn't cover himself. And I'm sure that, as ever, clubs will be creative in avoiding whatever punishments are due to them. The other thing to note is also that Chelsea at the moment are set to lose a couple of really high earners off their wage bill. Pedro's contract is up, Willian's contract is up, Marcos Alonso is expected to leave, Ross Barkley may leave too. These are all players that have been earning six figures. So from a wage bill standpoint, I would imagine that it's going to make very little difference. I think it's almost not legitimacy, but a trajectory issue. So if Frank Lampard were to finish in the top four this season, that's a very strong statement as a first Premier League season. If he doesn't, and as you say, players like Werner come in and Ziyech comes in, players who are leaving the Champions League behind, then that begins a slightly different conversation. And not in quite in the same way as Leicester, but it's long been assumed that Chelsea are heading for the Champions League too. So again, if as a group of young players, and I'm thinking of Mason Mount and Tammy Abraham, Hudson-Odoi, Loftus-Cheek, Reece James, Billy Gilmore, these players, that's quite damaging to fall away at that point of the season. That is not something that's easy to get away with, especially not during the formative years of a career.
And then obviously the other legacy club, Manchester United. You've already mentioned how Chelsea, Manchester United, they're going to be spending money regardless of whether or not they finish in Champions League spots. Manchester United have, over the last decade or so, been in and out of the Champions League, and they've been able to survive. They're too big to fail, to use the cliche. Mm-hmm. But now they've hit this sort of period of relative stability under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. How important would it be for them to finish in the top four? And I guess flipping the question on its head, how bad would it be if they didn't finish in the top four? Is there some point at which, there's a point of no return at which, the longer it takes them to get back into the Champions League, it starts having a negative impact on them?
I don't think so, because I think that should already happen now. You've used the cliche too big to fail, and I think it's true. Manchester United, in one way or another, have been failing for 7 years. Depending on which way you look at it, either from a footballing perspective, from a recruitment perspective, their recruiting strategies and structures are still incredibly archaic, and yet still they're able to put their hand in their pocket and spend huge amounts of money. Their revival this season is based on the ability to spend £60 million on a playmaker in January. It's a different game for a club like Manchester United. That being said, the overall level of debt has greatly increased at Manchester United, and that debt needs servicing. That is obviously part of the conversation about the Glazer family's ownership. I think it's very, very important for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, and that's purely from a footballing perspective. I think there is still a vocal school of thought that says that, okay, so things have improved and the nose of the club is now pointing upwards, but I think there's still a legitimate conversation to be had about how involved he is in that versus how valuable are the components and the assets with which he's been able to instruct this improvement. Now, that argument is incredibly boring. It's incredibly tedious. But it still exists, and it's something that can be defeated by being the guy that leads them back to the Champions League, because they're playing excellent football. They're very attractive to watch. Some of the players are really improving, and he has shown, at the very least, a capacity to develop the careers of young footballers, none more so than someone like Aaron Wan-Bissaka. A flawed player that could only defend is now a very rounded fullback and a legitimate candidate for the England fullback spot in next year's European Championship. So I think it's a rubber stamp, John. It's not an end of discussion moment, because if we're really saying that achievement for Manchester United is now finishing fourth, that's ridiculous, given the resources of the club. But it's an important waypoint for him personally, I think.
So which team do you think has the most to lose from failing to finish in the Champions League spots this season?
Well, I probably would say Wolves, actually, because I think it's the natural next step of their project. They've had this wonderful rise. When Wolves' project began, there's a lot of cynicism, not least around the role of George Mendes. Rightly so. It's probably healthy to be cynical. And they've seen this sort of year-on-year growth in performance and the quality of the playing squad and the kind of the tactical acumen and muscle of their manager, and this is just the next place for them to go. I think you almost kind of turn that question on its head and say, what do they lose without it? And I think what Wolves would lose without it is greater than anybody else. Chelsea is still going to sign very expensive footballers. Manchester United is still going to sign very expensive footballers. These clubs are still going to be able to corral blue chip brands. For Wolves, if you don't have that, and it may not refer specifically to this season, but if you don't have it this season or next, if you don't continue the upward trajectory, all of a sudden your playing assets start to doubt whether they can realise their ambition, and the manager's included in that as well. And it's a tightrope walk for a club like that. The sanctuary is provided by qualifying for the Champions League group stages.
You can find Seb Stafford-Bloor's work at Tifo Football, 442 and Football365. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or, if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.